My phone buzzed at 3:42 p.m. My 6-year-old daughter whispered into the line, "Mommy, Aunt Sarah hit me, she said she'll do it again if I tell." Then, I heard my sister's chilling voice, "Shut up." My parents stood right there calling it discipline. They thought I'd just take it, but they didn't know about a single document I made my sister sign 2 months ago. Watch until the end to see how one signature turned my family's life into a legal nightmare. My phone vibrated at 3:42 p.m. across the laminated desk of the Denver Emergency Operations Center. I'm Clara Bennett, a logistics coordinator, and I was buried in personnel logs when an unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. I answered, and the sound that met me was Lily, my 6-year-old, gasping through a wall of jagged sobs. "Mommy. Aunt Sarah hit me. She used the TV remote. She said if I told you, she'd do it again." A crash echoed in the background, followed by Sarah's sharp, venomous snarl. "Shut your mouth." The line went dead. My pulse hammered with a violence that drowned out the hum of the office. I didn't think, I simply dialed Deputy Marcus Miller. He was a friend, currently patrolling the Highlands neighborhood where my parents lived. "Marcus, it's Clara. Lily is at my parents' house on Sycamore Street. She's hurt. Please, get there now." I heard the sudden wail of a siren on his end. "On my way." Seconds later, a text flashed, "Arriving. Door breached." I was already in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The 30-minute drive felt like a descent into a fever dream. The city of Denver blurred into a gray smear of billboards and indifferent traffic. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Lily's voice breaking. When I finally veered onto Sycamore Street, the quiet suburban block was transformed by the rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights. Marcus had my sister, Sarah, pinned against the brick siding of the house, her arms forced behind her back. She was thrashing, her face a mask of indignant rage, while Marcus's radio crackled with static-heavy updates to dispatch. My parents, Arthur and Martha, stood on the porch with their arms folded. They watched the scene with the detached expressions of people witnessing a minor neighborhood nuisance. They had been helping with Lily since the divorce, claiming it was their way of easing my burden. Now, the sight of them made my stomach turn. "Lily!" I shouted, pushing past a responding officer. Marcus nodded toward the interior. "She's safe, Clara. The medics are with her." Inside, the air was thick and stagnant. Lily sat on the edge of the sofa, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. A female officer was kneeling beside her, speaking in a low, rhythmic murmur. My daughter looked up, her lip quivering. "Mommy." I dropped to the floor, pulling her into my arms. She buried her face in my neck, her small body shaking with a rhythmic, silent tremor. "It's okay, baby. I've got you. I'm not leaving." Outside, Marcus handed Sarah off to another officer to be cuffed. She glared at me through the screen door, her voice shrill. "This is a joke. She tripped. She's a clumsy kid." "Tripped?" I snapped, my voice trembling with a cold, sharp edge. Lily pulled back just enough to whisper into my ear. Aunt Sarah got mad because I spilled juice on the rug. She grabbed the remote and swung it at me. "It hurt so bad, Mommy." I gently turned her arm over. A fresh, angry welt was already beginning to purple. But as I looked closer, a paramedic, a woman with tired, knowing eyes, leaned in. "Ma'am, look here." She pointed to Lily's upper arm and shoulder. "These are older. Faded yellow and green. This wasn't a one-time incident." The room seemed to tilt. Older bruises. How had I missed them? The guilt hit me like a physical blow. In the corner, Arthur cleared his throat, his voice gruff and dismissive. "Clara, for heaven's sake, calm down. Your sister was just disciplining the girl." Martha nodded in silent agreement. Children need a firm hand, dear. Lily has been particularly fussy lately. Discipline. My blood turned to ice. You call this discipline? I turned back to my daughter, ignoring them. Tell the officer exactly what happened, Lily. Everything. Lily's voice was small, but it didn't waver. Aunt Sarah yells a lot when you're at work. She tells me I'm a burden. Then she hits me so I'll stay quiet. The officer jotting notes paused, his jaw tightening. Marcus stepped into the room, his hand resting on his belt. We have more than enough for a child endangerment charge. Sarah tried to lunge forward, the silver chain of the handcuffs rattling. You can't prove a thing. She's making it up. I turned to my parents, my voice a whisper of pure fury. You were in the house. Why didn't you stop her? Arthur shrugged, his eyes avoiding mine. We were in the kitchen. We heard the noise, but we figured Sarah had the situation under control. She's 6 years old, Martha added. She has to learn respect. Respect. The word felt like a profanity in that room. The paramedic began wrapping an ice pack around Lily's arm, her movements gentle and precise. Another officer moved through the living room, photographing the evidence, an overturned lamp, a juice stain on the carpet, and the heavy plastic remote lying on the floor with a hairline fracture running through its casing. Marcus pulled me aside, his expression grim. We're taking her to the hospital for a full forensic exam. We'll hold Sarah for questioning. I nodded, scooping Lily up. She clung to me like I was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Don't leave me again, Mommy. Never, I promised, my voice breaking. Never again. As we walked toward the ambulance, the sound of Sarah's denials followed us, punctuated by my parents' weak, hollow defenses. The paramedics were right, the faded marks told a story of a pattern I had been too blind, or too tired to see. At the hospital entrance, the sliding doors hissed open, revealing the harsh, sterile glow of the emergency department. Lily squeezed my hand, her small fingers trembling. I knew then that the nightmare hadn't ended, it had simply shifted into a new, more difficult chapter. But as I looked at the bruise on her arm, I knew one thing for certain. I would burn every bridge I had to ensure she never felt that kind of pain again. Inside the pediatric ER, the steady, clinical beep of the heart monitor was the only thing filling the silence. Lily lay on the exam table, her small hand still gripping mine with a desperate strength, while the nurses adjusted a mild for drip. Dr. Juliana Vance, a woman whose calm demeanor suggested she had seen the worst of humanity and survived it, reviewed the imaging on her tablet. Ms. Bennett, she said, gesturing for me to step toward the corner of the room. She kept her voice low, a soft baritone designed to shield Lily from the conversation. The trauma to her forearm is consistent with the impact you described. But these older marks, the ones on her shoulder and upper back. They've begun to yellow. They're at least a week old, maybe 2. A pattern. I whispered. The word felt like lead in my stomach. It suggests repeated incidents, Dr. Vance replied, her expression hardening with professional sympathy. We are required to file a report with Child Protective Services immediately. I'll provide you with copies of everything for your own legal protection. Lily looked up as I stepped back to the bedside, her eyes searching mine. Mommy, am I in trouble? No, sweetheart. You're the bravest girl I know. I kissed her forehead and stepped out into the hallway. My phone felt like a hot coal in my hand as I dialed Sarah. She picked up on the second ring. In the background, I could hear the muffled chaos of the station. What now, Clara? Sarah's voice was sharp, defensive. The police let me go with a citation. A warning. That's it. A warning. I forced my voice to remain steady, though my heart was thrashing against my ribs. The doctor just confirmed a pattern, Sarah. This wasn't the first time. There was a long silence, then a heavy, frustrated sigh. Doctors love to exaggerate. The kid is clumsy. Clumsy doesn't leave bruises in stages, I said, hitting the record button on my phone. Tell me why you did it. Sarah snapped. The dam finally broke. I hit her because she wouldn't stop crying. She was screaming over a spilled drink, and I'd had enough. You dump her on us every single day while you're off working those long shifts at the center. If you were actually a good mother, she wouldn't be such a mess. I let her rant, capturing every bitter syllable. 37 seconds of a taped confession. I ended the call without a word and immediately uploaded the file to a secure drive. Sitting on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, a memory surfaced with terrifying clarity. 2 months ago, when Lily started the first grade at her new school in the Highlands, Sarah had insisted on helping with the paperwork. We had sat in the cramped school office, piles of forms between us. One particular document had seemed innocuous at the time, a delegated parental authority form. It's just so I can pick her up if you're stuck on a double shift, Sarah had said, her pen scratching across the paper. For emergencies. At the time, I'd seen it as a gesture of support. Now, I realized it was a legal foothold she'd been building for months. Back in the exam room, Dr. Vance returned with the discharge papers. She's clear to go home. Keep ice on the arm and follow up with her pediatrician in a week. Lily sat up slowly, her voice a tiny murmur. Can we get ice cream soon, Mommy? Anything you want, honey. I helped her into a wheelchair, my mind racing. The recording burned in my pocket, evidence stacking like bricks. As the nurses wheeled us toward the exit, Lily began chattering about her school friends, a desperate attempt to distract herself from the day. I saved the audio file again, labeling it with the date and time. The fight had only just begun. 2 days later, the air in the small coffee shop on 17th Street was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the low hum of an espresso machine. It did nothing to cut through the suffocating tension at our table. I sat in a worn leather booth, facing my family. Sarah sat in the middle, flanked by Arthur and Martha. They looked as though they were attending a funeral. I had chosen a public place to keep the peace, but the silence between us was deafening. Lily was safe at home with a trusted colleague from work, shielded from the fallout. I placed my phone face down on the table, the recording app already running. We're here to settle this before it reaches a courtroom, I said, my voice level and cold. No more excuses. Sarah crossed her arms, her bravado starting to fray. Settle what? The police already backed off. It was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding doesn't explain the doctor's findings, I replied, refusing to let her see the emotion behind my eyes. Arthur adjusted his glasses, peering over a menu he had no intention of ordering from. He had always been the quiet enforcer of the family's reputation. Martha stirred a spoonful of sugar into her untouched tea, the silver clinking nervously against the porcelain. To break the stalemate, I reached out and tapped the play button on my phone. Sarah's voice, raw and unfiltered, filled the small space. The sound of her own confession made her hands begin to shake. The audio filled the small, crowded space of the cafe, drawing a few curious glances from nearby patrons. Sarah's voice, raw and unfiltered from our heated phone exchange, echoed between us, the confession of striking Lily out of frustration, the bitter attempt to shift the blame to my career. Sarah's hand, resting on her porcelain mug, began to tremble so violently that the coffee threatened to spill. She set it down with a sharp clatter. You recorded that without telling me. Evidence doesn't require permission when a child's life is at stake, I replied, watching the tremor spread from her fingers to her shoulders as she gripped the edge of the table. It was a bad day, she defended, her voice pitching higher, bordering on hysteria. Lily can be so disobedient. Talking back, making messes. I only tapped her to get her attention. Tapped. The word burned in my throat, but I kept my face a mask of cold composure. The medical report says otherwise. Arthur finally interjected with a low grunt, though no actual words followed. He leaned back into the vinyl booth, his arms folded tight across his chest, observing the scene like a spectator who refused to get his hands dirty. I slid the medical folder across the table, opening it to the sections I had highlighted in yellow. There were diagrams of bruise locations, timelines estimating the age of each injury, and the physician's unambiguous conclusion of non-accidental trauma. "Read it yourself," I said. "Patterns over several weeks." Sarah's shaking intensified as she leafed through the pages, her free hand balling into a tight fist. "She's always been clumsy. She falls at the park. She bumps into the furniture. Clumsiness doesn't align with these specific markings, Sarah." I pointed to a note regarding the repetition of the injuries. "This goes far beyond accidents." Martha reached for the document, her eyes scanning the pages quickly before she passed it to her husband. "We trusted you were handling things," she murmured, though the comment seemed directed more at Sarah's incompetence than at the abuse itself. A server approached with coffee refills, but sensing the radioactive tension, he retreated swiftly without a word. Sarah's excuses began to flow faster now, a desperate torrent of rationalization. "Kids test boundaries. I was teaching her the lessons you skip because of your long shifts. Lessons delivered with force aren't lessons, Sarah. They're assaults." Arthur shifted uncomfortably but remained silent, his stoicism acting as a tacit admission of his own complicity. I reached into my bag and produced the document I had spent the previous night drafting, a formal relinquishment agreement. It was a straightforward form, a legal waiver of any current or future guardianship claims. "Sign this," I commanded. "Transfer all rights to me exclusively. Supervised contact only, and only if it's earned." Sarah's tremor peaked. She held the pen as if the plastic were red hot. "You're forcing my hand." "I'm protecting hers." The vinyl of the booth creaked under our shifting weight. At the counter, a group of college students laughed loudly, their joy a jarring contrast to the gravity of the table. Arthur broke his silence briefly, his voice a low rumble. "Consider the family name, Clara." "Family prioritizes safety over reputation," I countered without a second's hesitation. Martha whispered a frantic urging for Sarah to comply, and for a few long minutes, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, the pen descended. Sarah's signature was a jagged, reluctant scrawl across the bottom of the page. "There. Happy." She spat. "Not happy. Just resolved." I collected the form, the paper feeling heavy with a weary sense of relief. The atmosphere remained thick, a fragile bridge to a very cold peace. Outside, I saw Marcus's cruiser parked at the curb. He texted me a simple, "ready if needed." I slid the freshly inked waiver aside and brought out the older stack of authorization documents from the school, aligning them precisely in the center of the table so Sarah had no choice but to see them. "Before anyone leaves," I said evenly, "look closer at what you signed months ago." Sarah eyed the pile with weary suspicion. "More tricks." "No tricks. Just consequences." I flipped to the key page from Lily's school registration, pointing to the care delegation clause I had underlined. "This isn't just a temporary pickup approval. It's an extended caregiving authority, valid for ongoing decisions in my absence." In Colorado, the courts recognize this as foundational for permanent placement when combined with evidence of harm. Her expression shifted from defensive anger to stunned, hollow disbelief. "You're saying this old form gives you everything?" "It establishes me as the sole primary guardian, without any further need for a challenge. It was ironclad the moment you signed it at the school office." Sarah grabbed the document, her eyes darting across the legalese, searching desperately for a loophole that didn't exist. Her shock curdled into a sudden, white-hot fury. She attempted to shred the paper, her nails digging into the fibers, but I intervened, securing the originals before she could do any real damage. "You deceived me," she yelled, her voice cracking the cafe's quiet. "You set this up right from the start. I secured my daughter's future, I said, tucked the pages safely into my folder. You chose not to read what you were signing. Arthur extended a hand to calm Sarah, his face turning a shade of ashen gray. We weren't aware of the full scope of that document. It looked like a standard permission slip, Martha added, her voice trembling. It was an insurance policy, I replied. Sarah persisted in ripping the duplicate copy I had provided, the fragments scattering like confetti across the table. This was a setup, she accused, the crumpled pieces of paper balled in her palm. It was protection. And it worked. It was protection. And it worked. My tone remained unflinching. Her own haste had created the opening, and my vigilance had closed it. Arthur tried to reason with her as she clawed at the paper. Sarah, stop. Destroying a copy changes nothing. The original is already filed. Martha added softly, her voice trembling. We only thought the arrangement helped everyone. Helped. The word echoed hollowly against the brick walls of the cafe. Sarah's attempts grew frantic, her fingers tearing at another section of the duplicate until a server intervened, politely offering a small trash bin to collect the remnants of her rage. Through the window, I saw Marcus watching, his presence a silent promise of intervention if the situation turned volatile. The legal strategy was a locked chain, the long-term authorization from months ago, bolstered by the fresh medical evidence and the recorded confession, formed an unbreakable path to sole custody. Sarah finally slumped into the booth, exhausted by her own futile destruction. How could you manipulate your own family like this? Manipulation would have been staying silent while you broke my daughter's spirit, I said, gathering my things. This is simply ensuring Lily has a future. Arthur conceded quietly, his shoulders sagging. Perhaps we overlooked the signs. Martha began to tear up, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Blood ties shouldn't end this way, Clara. Ties break when trust does, I replied. Even the shredded duplicates on the table underscored the point, some things, once broken, cannot be mended. The legal proceedings moved with a cold, efficient speed. A week later, we sat in a family courtroom in downtown Denver. The old wooden benches creaked as the gallery settled, and the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights felt like a physical weight. I had filed for an emergency hearing based on imminent risk, and the system had responded. Lily waited in a supervised play area down the hall, safely tucked away with a social worker. Judge Elias Thorne entered, his black robe swishing with authoritative poise as he took the bench. Case of Bennett versus Sarah Miller. Custody modification and emergency protective order. My attorney presented the bundle, the care authorization Sarah had signed at the school, the recent relinquishment waiver, and the detailed medical reports tracing the timeline of the injuries. Sarah sat at the opposing table, her face drawn and pale, flanked by a public defender. Arthur and Martha sat behind her, their expressions a fluctuating mix of defiance and deep-seated anxiety. Proceed with the evidence, the judge commanded. I testified calmly. I recounted the terror of that initial phone call, the scene at the ranch house, and the harrowing confirmation from the pediatric ER. These were not isolated incidents, I told the court. My daughter lives in fear of the person who was supposed to protect her. The cross-examination was brief and desperate. The defense tried to highlight my work schedule, suggesting that my long shifts left gaps in supervision. Gaps that were filled by family, I countered, until that trust was used as a weapon. Judge Thorne signaled for the exhibits. He donned a pair of headphones to listen to the audio recording privately. I watched his brow furrow as Sarah's recorded voice admitted to the strikes. He then moved to the doctor's annotated charts, the healing stages, the locations of the bruises, the clinical conclusion of intent. Clear, non-accidental trauma, he murmured, his voice audible in the silent room. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, whispering frantically to her lawyer. Arthur gripped the wooden rail in front of him, his knuckles turning a ghostly white, while Martha dabbed at her eyes. The court-appointed guardian ad litem submitted a brief report from her interview with Lily. The minor child expresses a profound dread of returning to the relative's home, she stated. We recommend immediate and sole placement with the petitioner. Judge Thorne nodded. Any rebuttal? Sarah's side offered character references from her former colleagues, but the judge waved them aside with a flick of his wrist. Irrelevant in the face of physical evidence and a recorded confession. The deliberation was short. Judge Thorne reviewed the statutes on his screen, then looked up with a gaze that felt like a gavel strike. Given the audio confession, the medical corroboration, and the prior authorization establishing the petitioner as the primary caregiver, I am ruling decisively. Sole legal and physical custody is awarded to Clara Bennett. There will be no shared decision-making. A wave of relief washed over me, though it was tempered by the sheer exhaustion of the journey. Furthermore, the judge continued, Sarah Miller is prohibited from any contact with the child. A permanent restraining order is hereby issued. Sarah gasped a sharp, choked sound. The ruling would trigger an automatic review at her workplace, a local youth center, likely resulting in an immediate suspension. As for the grandparents, Judge Thorne addressed my parents, his voice hardening. Visitation rights are revoked indefinitely due to the failure to intervene in an ongoing abusive situation. You may petition for reinstatement only after completing mandatory counseling and receiving a formal clearance. Martha stifled a sob. Arthur stood briefly, looking as though he wanted to speak, but he sat back down, defeated by the weight of the law. The clerk typed the order rapidly, making the restrictions explicit. A bailiff escorted Sarah out first. My parents lingered for a moment, approaching me with hesitant steps. Clara, please, Martha whispered. Reconsider. I did reconsider, I said, looking her in the eye. I considered my daughter's safety. The answer is no. The courtroom emptied gradually, the echoes of the gavel fading into the quiet of the halls. The decision was final. The protection was sealed. A few weeks later, the atmosphere was different. In our new apartment in a quiet corner of the city, children's music played softly from a speaker on the bookshelf. The living room was cozy, filled with the scent of fresh pine, and the gentle melodies that masked the distant hum of Denver traffic outside. We were starting over, one unpacked box at a time. The move to a quieter pocket of Denver, closer to the logistics center and Lily's new elementary school, had been the final step in our exodus. Unpacked boxes still lined the hallway, but the atmosphere was light, purged of the heavy, stagnant air of the past. Evenings became a sanctuary of small rituals, stories over dinner, bedtime without the looming presence of shadows. Lily rested peacefully now, her small bed tucked beneath a canopy of glow-in-the-dark stars that mapped out a safer world. The nightmares that used to jolt her awake had finally begun to recede. Weekly therapy sessions helped her unpack the fears that had been buried too deep for a 6-year-old to carry. In the mornings, she would bound into the kitchen with a newfound energy, chattering about her drawings or her new friends. One afternoon, she presented me with a crayon masterpiece, 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a vibrant rainbow. Across the top, she had scrawled, "Mommy and me forever." "For you," she beamed, hugging my legs. I knelt down, admiring the wax-scented colors. "It's beautiful, honey. This goes right on the fridge." Her creativity flourished in the sunlight of our new life. On weekends, the kitchen table was a chaotic landscape of paints and papers. Occasionally, I joined her, our laughter echoing through the rooms as we painted abstract worlds together. One evening, over mugs of cocoa, I spoke to her gently about trust. "People we love should always make us feel safe, Lily. Never scared. True family listens and protects." She nodded thoughtfully, her small face reflected in the surface of her drink. "Like you do, Mommy. Always." That conversation felt like a final stitching of a wound that had once seemed irreparable. Life settled into a rhythm of park outings, library visits, and the simple joy of baking cookies on rainy afternoons. Lily thrived, her confidence blooming in the tiny victories of childhood, like tying her own laces or reading a whole page without stopping. Mail arrived routinely, but one envelope stood out, bearing the familiar, rigid handwriting of my mother. Inside was a letter scripted with careful, trembling apologies. Arthur and Martha wrote of their regret for what they called their oversight, expressing a desperate hope that we might reconnect someday. I read it in the silence of the kitchen, felt a ghost of old emotions stir, and then folded the paper away into a drawer without a response. Healing required a focus on the present, and reopening those wounds served no one but the people who had allowed them to happen. At night, after tucking Lily in, I would sit in the quiet and reflect on the journey, the phone call that had shattered my illusions, the evidence that had fortified my resolve, and the courtroom that had finally drawn the lines. Strength had emerged from the wreckage, teaching me a permanent, piercing vigilance. During story time one night, Lily murmured sleepily into her pillow. "I love you most in the whole world. I love you more, sweetie." Her words held a warmth that went deeper than any legal resolution. This ordeal had underscored a vital, universal truth: parenthood demands a fierce, uncompromising advocacy, even, and perhaps especially, when the harm comes from within one's own kin. Blood may define a relation, but it is action that forges a family. To those standing in similar shadows, I can only say this: trust your instincts, find your voice, and always prioritize the vulnerable. No child deserves the weight of silence. Breaking it is what saves them.